Hello and welcome back to another podcast. Now, what I'm going to talk about in this podcast is the biggest mistakes that people tend to make when they are shooting in low light. And that's particularly important with wildlife photography because a lot of it happens in less than ideal lighting conditions. So that's really what we're going to be talking about over the next half hour or so. So before I dive in, please remember to like and subscribe, and don't keep me a secret. Please let people know if you find these helpful. So generally shooting wildlife, when I talk about it, there are certain things I'll recommend which are definitely the right thing to do in normal lighting. However, one of the problems with wildlife is that a lot of the action will happen once the sun has gone down. And this obviously makes it a little bit challenging because flash is not really an option. Because what you'll be doing is definitely startling the animal. You might startle yourself. That can all end quite badly. So don't use flash is basically the rule there. So I'm going to step through some of the common mistakes people make. Now, the first one is using an ISO setting that is too low. So if you're familiar with ISO, you'll know that the higher the ISO you use, although you make the sensor in your digital camera more sensitive, you start introducing digital noise. So you start getting very pixely images, particularly if you have areas of one solid color. So normally in normal light, you want to run with as low an ISO as you can, depending on other things like the kind of aperture you need, what's going on in terms of movement. However, if you do that when the lighting conditions are very low, what you are going to get is an image that's very underexposed. You might get a lot of motion in there, depending on whether your hand holding the camera or you're on a tripod, but your subject is moving. So what I would say is don't be afraid of using the higher ISO values. Now, over short periods, sensors work pretty well. Now, you will get noise if you're doing astro, and this is why, in fact, there are other reasons why, but a lot of these really amazing astro images are made up of multiple images put together. So don't be afraid of using a higher ISO. It's always better to have an image that's a little bit noisy, a little bit grainy, but sharp enough that you can see what's going on and something that looks quite clean. So again, the purpose of doing the photography is to try and give the viewer some way of connecting or seeing an animal in a way they wouldn't normally see it. So it's always better to work with a more grainy image, a noisier image that you can do. So, and usually in post-processing, I'll talk about that, you can reduce the amount of grain that's showing anyway, the amount of noise that's showing. So that's number one. Don't be afraid to use a higher ISO. Now, the next mistake is to get the shutter speed too slow. Now, this is a general thing when you're hand holding. So you need to remember the reciprocal law. So 1 over the focal length of the lens gives you your minimum handheld shutter speed. If that doesn't make any sense to you, try and keep it double figures at least. It will depend on the size of the lens you're using. So obviously with a small lens, small wide angle, for example, holding that is a lot easier than holding a camera with, say, a 400mm telephoto on. You're going to get a bit of a wobble there, and the angle of view that you have through a longer lens is much narrower as well. So it means that any movement is going to be amplified in the image. So in other words, if you're looking at wide angle, you've got a big angle of view. And if you've got some slight movement, you might get away with it depending on your shutter speed. But if you are looking through a telephoto lens, you've got a very narrow angle of view. So you're really focused in on a particular subject. And if you move even very slightly, certainly you'll lose the position of that subject in the frame, and you will definitely see movement. So that is definitely a rule to remember. So, and just to give you the non-mathematical explanation of that rule. If you're using a 100mm lens, then the slowest shutter speed you should be thinking about when you're hand holding is 1/100th of a second. If it's a 400mm lens, 1/400th of a second. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. So what can you do? Well, obviously you might have to reduce the shutter speed because of low light. So there are techniques. I've already spoken about ISO. I'll talk about aperture as well. But each of those will impact how much light or how sensitive to light the camera is. And in low light, obviously you want the camera to be quite sensitive. You want as much light coming in and onto the sensor as you can get. So shutter speed will tend to be slower so that your the curtain, the shutter is open for a much longer period, which obviously lets more light in. Obviously, when you're doing that, there's a much greater opportunity for camera shake if you're hand holding. So you ideally want to be on a tripod if you've got one. I use a couple. I've got quite a large Manfrotto that I use for more sort of studio things, or if I'm taking the gear somewhere where I don't have to hike for too long, then I'll take a heavier tripod. And I also use that for Astro. There are also lightweight tripods. So I've got one that weighs about 1 kilo, and that's the kind of thing, for example, I had with me when I went up Kilimanjaro, because that will go in a bag quite easily, and it means you can keep what you're carrying to a minimum, but still have the option of using a tripod. And also just, while I think about it, if you are using a tripod and you don't have to fully extend the legs, then the thing to do is to extend the thicker sections first, so the upper sections of the tripod first. If you look at a tripod, when you fully extend the leg, the sections at the bottom where the feet are tend to be a bit thinner, so they will tend to wobble a bit more inherently. So to keep the thing as rigid as possible, just undo the leg sections from the top, not from the bottom. You can, if you've got a way of hooking something onto the bottom of the central column of the tripods where you would mount the camera, if you can hang something heavy there, that will also provide a degree of stability, which will minimize camera shake. It might not be what you're doing, but it might be very windy. So this is another good thing to do. Final thing on tripods while I think about it, might come back to gear later. But if you have a remote release, that makes a huge difference. So that makes it much, much easier, because it means when you press the shutter, you're not physically touching the camera, because that can also introduce some movement. If you don't have a remote release, then the alternative you have is that most cameras have a self-timer. You will generally find settings of 3 seconds and 10 seconds. So what they're used for, the 10 second is to allow you to do a selfie. Basically, it gives you a chance to press the shutter button and then get in the frame. The 3 second is there to allow you to overcome exactly this issue. So you press the shutter button, nothing happens for 3 seconds, by which time any movement you might have introduced has damped down and gone. So the key on shutter speed is to really go as slow as you can on shutter speed, so you're maximizing the amount of light getting into the camera, getting onto the sensor or onto the film if you're using film. Okay, mistake number 3 is not using a fast lens. But what's a fast lens? So basically, the bigger the aperture, the maximum aperture that the lens will give you, the faster the lens. So how do you know? Well, if you look at typical telephotos, they tend to be fairly thin diameter. And this does relate directly to the actual physical diameter of the lens. So a lot of particularly cheap telephotos will have quite a small diameter. That means that your maximum aperture could be something like f8, f5.6. So basically the f number needs to be as small as possible. And when you start moving to larger aperture lenses, so they are physically bigger in diameter, that's when you start getting down to f2, f1.8. So basically the bigger the aperture, the smaller the f number, the better, because that's allowing more light into the camera. Obviously that does impact depth of field. as we all know. So you need to be aware of that and just find the right trade-off that gives you maximum aperture, a depth of field that you can work with, but also an amount of light that gives you the shutter speed that will give you a good shot. And again, obviously with a big aperture, you might be able to reduce the ISO a little bit to minimize noise. So where do you get big apertures? Well, if you're using prime lenses, then that's where you're likely to find big apertures. You may well get zoom lenses, for example, that give you a good aperture, but they tend to get very expensive very quickly. So for most of us, it's a compromise. It's running with the biggest aperture that the lens will give us at that particular magnification if you're on a zoom lens, because remember, the maximum aperture is different from where you're fully zoomed out to fully zoomed in. You'll be getting different results. And if this is not making much sense, then I recommend either you take my course or you go and experiment and just see what happens with the equipment you've got. And that is the best thing to do, because you really need to know how your camera gear works in low light situations. So essentially, when it comes to lenses, if a prime lens works for you, it's definitely the preferred option in this scenario to go with a prime lens. But for most, and I'll include myself, I prefer to use zoom lenses because they give me a bit more flexibility. And I also like to minimize what I'm carrying about with me. So there will be a trade-off, but basically you want the fastest lens that you can get your hands on to when you're in low light situations. Okay, another thing that probably won't work is autofocus. So that's number 4. So autofocus definitely needs a certain amount of light to work. What will happen if once you start getting into low light, the chances are that your autofocus won't work. So you may be able to find a workaround, and the thing I tend to do is to just try and find a light source of some sort that's roughly the same distance from me as my subject, and if I can get away with that, I'll use it. Often we can't, so it's then a case of estimating, and you might have to switch to manual focus and just set a depth of field that means that your subject is hopefully going to be in focus, because you do want them to be in focus. So that may mean that you've got to practice a little bit with manual focus and just guessing distances to things. So again, if you haven't done that before, get out and practice. A little bit of practice will go a long way in situations like this. You may be able to use a flashlight, but if you're waving a flashlight around when you're trying to photograph wildlife at night, not really the best look. So often with the wildlife situation, in other kinds of photography, if you're in urban photography and you're photographing buildings or whatever's around, then you can absolutely get away with it by just focusing on finding something that's illuminated that you can focus on. With wildlife, chances are you don't have a light source nearby, so you're going to have to really put in a bit of practice and get good at estimating distances. Okay, another thing to remember is that you should have exposure compensation on your camera. So this is something that you need to, again, perhaps practice with, get a better understanding on. So for most photography, I would always recommend leaving exposure compensation at 0 as a general rule. However, if you're finding that you are getting underexposed images, then think about using exposure compensation, or you could try auto bracketing on your camera. So that might give you. So typically, what happens with auto bracketing, you'll get 3 photographs taken: one with 0 exposure compensation, one underexposed by a certain amount, the other overexposed by a certain amount, and you can normally set what that is. So it might be a third of a stop, it might be a full stop. So depending on your camera, you'll have different things you can set up. So again, this is something to explore. If it's an aspect of your camera that you don't know, get to know exposure compensation and then experiment with it. It's as simple as that. So generally, if you are underexposing, just put in, or if it's a low light situation, you probably want to put in an overexposed slightly, maybe by a stop or 2 stops, just experiment. So that might be -1, -2 EV. You want to preserve mood as far as possible, but obviously you do want to be able to see what you're looking at. So it is, as with all of these things, it's understanding the principles, it's understanding how to implement it on your camera, but ultimately it's being able to experiment when you're in the field. So again, thing to do is experiment before when you're not in the field, so that when you do get there, you know what you're doing, and you can make these changes very quickly and very quickly start getting results that work. Another thing you might want to think about is white balance. So I'm not someone who changes white balance very much. It tends to be more of an issue if you're in artificial lighting conditions. So, for example, tungsten can give you a bluish tinge. So have a look, do test shots, see what you're getting. If you find you're getting a color tinge, then the chances are that's down to the lighting that you are in. So if you're getting a cast on the images, think about changing your white balance or use Kelvin mode, something like that. So you can change the color temperature to get the right exposure. Again, this is something that's covered in the course that I provide. It's not something I'm going to explain in 2 minutes on a podcast. So again, if this is something that you've seen, though, if you're getting a color cast on your images, then that may well be one of the things that's going on. So explore that a bit further. One thing I will say, and this is the next one, number 7, is always shoot raw. So not shooting raw is something that people do. If you've listened to anything I talk about, I always say shoot raw. And that's just a rule, and I think it's a very good one. RAW gives you all the information that the camera has been able to capture for any given image. So that will be the full details from the image, every pixel. It also has other metadata that you may or may not want. What people will sometimes do is try and shoot in JPEG. It might be because they're familiar with the format, because we use JPEGs all the time. If you're using social media or anything like that, the downside to JPEGs is that they are compressed, and they're compressed so that the file size is quite small relatively to the original image. And the reason that that's useful is that it reduces the size that particular image will take up on the computer, on the hard drive. It means that you can download it faster, you can upload it faster. So all of these things are good, and particularly if you're looking at websites, you do want the JPEGs are great for that, because it means you can download the images on the website very quickly. People are notoriously, and I'm one of these, but people are notoriously impatient when it comes to downloading website pages. So you really want those images coming down fast. However, for wildlife photography, you want your original image to have as much information in it as possible. Because once you've got that, once you've shot, and that's what RAW gives you. RAW is basically the format that the camera manufacturer uses. So it'll have a different extension. Mine, Canon, produces .cr2 files. You may well be seeing a different extender. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is that file will be quite large, and I always shoot them as big as my camera will take them, because that gives me maximum information, maximum detail. I can then work from that. So obviously from a position of having a big file, you can reduce it to a much, much smaller one, but going the other way is really, really hard. And there isn't the data there. So there are packages like Topaz Labs do a JPEG to RAW artificial intelligence program. So that may give you usable results, but again, I would say always shoot in RAW, get it right in the first place, and then you have a lot of flexibility as to what you do with that image. Okay, number 8. Your subject might be moving. So it's all well and good setting up an exposure for something that's stationary, but of course animals move, and Look, there's pros and cons to this. So yeah, it's nice to have nice, sharp, static images of an animal. Equally, if they're moving and getting a bit of movement in there, depending on how it comes out, that can create quite an interesting photograph. And this is all down to individual preferences, down to a bit of creativity. It's getting that outcome that maybe gives you a really unusual image, and it may be quite an engaging image, something that you really love, that gets people to look at it. So the thing to remember is that the subject is likely to move. If it's moving really quickly in low light and you don't have a very fast lens, you're likely to struggle a little bit, but, shoot the image. I think the key thing is to always shoot the image and then decide what you want to do with it later. And one thing I will say on this as well is if you are out there and you're shooting and you're looking at images straight away, don't be tempted to delete them. There is a temptation, if you're not happy with something, just to create, particularly if you're shooting big raw files, to just allow a bit more space on the memory cards. But I would suggest you use big memory cards so you don't have to do that. It's a really good tip to not look at photographs immediately beyond what you need to do, just to check exposure and that kind of thing. Certain professional photographers that I know won't look at an image for 3 months. And the reason for doing that is that when you look at an image immediately after you've shot it, what you're doing is you're comparing it to the image you have in your mind, or that you had in your mind when you took the shot. And the chances are it will be different. And if you are a bit disappointed with what you've got, you're disappointed because it hasn't measured up to what you had in mind in the first place. So there is that temptation to delete it. However, if you leave it a few months and then look at that image, you're just looking at it as an image in its own right, as a standalone, with no preconceptions about it. You're not prejudging it. When you look at an image that way, you may well see something in it that you hadn't seen before. And I've certainly experienced this, where some of my favorite images are images that perhaps initially I would have just deleted because they weren't what I had in mind. But as an image in their own right, they deliver something else that perhaps I hadn't thought of. So don't forget about subject movement. So when you do have a moving subject, obviously you want your ISO to be a little bit higher because you need more sensitivity. You want your shutter speed to be higher, your aperture as wide as you can get, and try burst mode. I often shoot in burst, particularly if what I'm going to get is a little bit unpredictable. It gives you it just maximizes chances of producing an image that's sharp, that delivers what you want. So use burst mode when you are using subject, when you're photographing a moving subject. Right. Number 9 is not overusing noise reduction. So again, another mistake that people make is they apply too much either in-camera or post-process noise reduction. And what happens is you start to lose texture, you lose detail, it looks really plasticky, you might get really strange things starting to go on with the color, you might get hues around parts of the image, so maybe the animal's head, that kind of thing. So the tip here is to, as with anything, particularly in post-processing, go easy. Don't go crazy with it unless you really want to get a really sort of abstract-looking image. So keep the noise reduction down to at least a moderate use. Use local adjustments, so lighting, that kind of thing. Just, again, minimum adjustments. Preserve detail where you can, because you can't get it back in again. So it's a lot easier to remove a little bit of noise when you're actually shooting the image than losing details. So when you're shooting, do all the things I've already suggested so that you get the best possible captured image, and then minimize post-processing. It may be that you just can't resolve the image, so you might have to think of other things. Sometimes I'll just flip an image into black and white and work with it there. The adjustments can be a little bit more forgiving in black and white, and also you get a different look anyway, because when you see an image in black and white, it's different to an image that we see in color. In color, we tend to see the thing, we see what's in color. Black and white is all about shapes and textures, so it's a different experience as an image. So that's worth thinking about, and it may be that the image doesn't really fly as a colored image, but you can get something usable in black and white. And then the final thing is to just be aware of light sources. So think about how you're using light sources that might be in frame. So you might have the moon, for example, that might provide backlight. If you are more in a street type scenario, you might have street lights, lights from windows, even phone screens. So how can you make use of light that's there? You might have spotlights. So if, for example, you're a waterhole and you're taking pictures at night at a waterhole, at some locations they will put lighting there. So that can be really useful. So it's good to understand that and think about how you use it. You get the classic pictures of an animal with its face lit and reflected in a waterhole while it's drinking. So you've got all that kind of thing. If you're just out and about, it's a case of just being aware of what light is there and making the most of what you have. So you might be, the options might be quite limited, but do think about it and think about light direction, how that's influencing color. If you can move, again, move so that you can make the most of it. But again, with wildlife, it tends to be a bit limiting. Okay, so that is really a quick summary of the mistakes that people make. So just going back to using low light, because that is likely to be a situation that you're going to come across at some point when you're doing wildlife photography. So the first thing is to really go through the things I've already covered in the mistakes, but flip those around so that they are advantages, things you know how to make use of. Know your camera, understand how it works, and how to change certain settings so that you're ready to go in low light. Low light can give you really dramatic photographs, so it's not something to avoid. It's definitely something to embrace, but you do need to know how to make the most of it, so you can get amazing mood in low light situations. In terms of the gear, just be smart with how you're using your camera. So get familiar with how to use ISO aperture shutter speed in low light conditions. Understand what a fast lens is, and the chances are you don't have a fast lens. You might be lucky you might have one, but the chances are you're working with lenses that are less than ideal for low light. So how can you get the most from them? Be really aware of your lens choices, and maybe if you're looking at buying a lens, I always recommend manufacturers' pro lenses, but that's because you will get best results from there. Or a lot of the independents are really good now, but where you've got the option of a faster lens, I would definitely suggest you seriously consider that, even if it means paying a little bit more for the lens itself. Tripods, think about tripods if you can take one, or look at other things you can use. If you don't have a tripod or you're not able to take one, what can you use as a way of just supporting the camera? It may be something where you put the camera down and you leave it there, or it might be that you brace yourself and the camera against something. So again, it could be part of a vehicle. If it is and the engine's running, I recommend damping, particularly in low light. So use a pad of some sort, maybe rolled up fleece, something like that, between the camera and the vehicle body, because if you've got an engine running, you're going to get vibration coming through, and that will definitely transmit through to the camera if the camera is hard up against the metal of the vehicle. So if you put a fleece or something in the way, that's likely to dampen out most, if not all, of the vibration that's coming through the vehicle. Basically, the thing to do if you don't have a tripod is just get a little bit creative on how you can rest the camera somewhere. If I'm resting the camera against something and I'm shooting a long exposure, I'll actually push hard against something so that I've got that pressure kind of locking myself and the camera against whatever I'm supporting myself against for the duration that the shutter is open. But you need to be in a stable position. And don't forget the self-timer on the camera. That can be really handy if you don't have remote release. Really, with lighting, obviously we look at golden hour, we look at blue hour. That you're definitely in blue hour, you're getting into low light scenarios, or you might go beyond that. So it really is a case of making the most of what light is there. Get creative. If you're being backlit, then how can you make use of the backlighting? Because you might not be able to move. That might be all you've got. So what can you do with that? So again, look at other people's work. Look at how other photographers have handled low light situations, and have some ideas. If you can't come up with ideas yourself, copy somebody else. It's always it's probably how they got them. And also think about how you can use shadows. All of these things can add depth to the image. So it's about getting creative. It's about not being intimidated by low light, but looking at it as another opportunity that you have. So you can also, if you've got motion happening, think about panning with slow shutter speeds. So again, that is definitely worth doing. So what I used to do quite regularly when I photographed motor racing and aircraft, so that wouldn't necessarily be in low light, but I'm doing panning shots with something that's moving quickly. If you can stay on the subject and blur the background, they're really good shots. So in low light, you might have the animal moving. So depending on the animal, it may keep its head reasonably still and everything else moves. So that can be quite an interesting shot. So experiment. I would have a go. Take the view that you're probably not going to get anything usable, but you never know. So have a go and see what happens. Do remember about focusing. So the chances are autofocus won't work. So you've got to now look at how can you set up manual focus and give yourself sufficient depth of field to get an image that's reasonably sharp. So again, it will depend on your distance from the animal. You can get away with narrower depth of field when you are further away because that gives you a physically bigger area that's actually in focus, but you're going to have to get familiar with that and work it out. Deal with noise. I don't do any in-camera noise reduction. Generally, I'll do that in post. I like to keep it as clean as possible in the camera. I also don't want the camera doing that much. I remember shooting whales in low light, and I was just turning off as much as possible in the camera because it was trying to process stuff, and I needed it taking repeated shots as often as I could. And if you've listened to me before, I will have said that the burst rate or duration on the Canon I use, the EOS 5D, is actually quite limited because it's a very big sensor, high resolution sensor, which means you've got a very big file because I'm capturing the biggest file that camera will shoot, and it's then trying to write it to the drives within the camera itself. So I have the fastest memory cards that I could get at the time, but even so, that it takes a finite time to do that. And what that means when you're trying to do a long burst, very fast shutter speed, is that it will run for a second or so, and then it has to pause and catch up. So be aware of these kind of aspects of your camera, because all of these will have an impact on what happens when you're in the field. Okay, so that pretty much rounds it up. Hopefully that's given you some suggestions and ideas that you can implement and practice with for low light situations. If you are going away somewhere, if you're going on safari, or if you are being an urban wildlife photographer, as we spoke about in the last podcast, think about these techniques. In fact, in the urban environment, a lot of animals only come out at night when it's a lot quieter, and you can get some absolutely stunning shots and you've probably got good lighting actually with street lighting depending on where you are. So low light photography is definitely something to think about, to practice with, to get on top of, and you can produce some really amazing and unusual photographs when you've mastered it. or even if you haven't mastered it, if you have a go, you might get really lucky. All right, I hope you found that useful. If you have, please give me a like and subscribe if I've earned that, and I will speak to you in the next podcast. So bye for now. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Now, I just want to say thank you for tuning in and joining me in the Wildlife and Adventure Photography podcast. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please give me a like, a subscribe, maybe tell your friends, and by all means leave a comment. And if there is a subject you would like me to cover in the future, please let me know, and I'll be very happy to do my best. So thanks again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again next podcast. Bye for now.